Assalamu alaikum class. Today we are starting off with our lecture number 9, which is supposed to talk about measurement of variables. Basically, prior to this, we were talking about the research design elements, such as the study setting, time horizon, unit of analysis. We talked about basically that while conducting the research, we need to plan, and in the planning stage, we basically talk about and discuss that what kind of study setting would be required, the study time horizon needs to be decided, and the unit of analysis needs to be decided. Apart from that, we also need to talk about that how are we going to measure the variables for which we are conducting the study. As you know that earlier, we had identified different variables which were important to our study, such as independent, dependent, and mediating, moderating variables. The task now is to measure these variables in a way that we are able to do the kind of analysis and on it, and the way we need to do these. Measure these variables in a way that we are able to find the results the way we want, or the solutions to the problem we want. So unless and until we don't have a way of measuring these variables, we won't be able to have any supporting data to finally decide on to what sort of action one should take. That is that while collecting data, we need to basically understand that how we're going to measure that data, and for that different variables, as we said, had been identified, and we need to see that how we're going to measure against each variable. And as the term variable indicates, that it is an entity which can have different values. Let's say if we were to measure the average salary of an employee, then the variable as far of our interest is salary, and we need to see how we're going to measure it. And the way we need to measure is that we try to get the dollar or the rupees or the pounds of money earned by that individual in a month or in a year or whatsoever. So the question now is that how are we going to measure the data, measure the variable, so that we can get the data on which we can run different analysis and reach a conclusion for our study. So the measurement is a very important aspect, and we need to see that the variables we are using, we need to see how we're going to measure those variables. Again, we said that we need to measure the variables so that we can do hypothesis testing, and we said earlier that all these hypothesis testing are sometimes based on statistical tools which basically need some kind of data some type, more usually a type of a quantitative data on which we can make certain calculations and make certain decisions, such as sales, such as salaries, such as income, or in some cases such as motivation. We need to measure these variables so that we can, at the end of the day, we can come up to know that what are the values of these variables, and see the relationship between these variables in terms of their values. So to find the answers to our questions and to statistically prove the hypothesis, we need to measure the variables. Some of the variables, as I was talking about, can be easily measured, such as height, salary, hour work. There you have a very straightforward measurement unit for that. But for some aspects, such as motivation, loyalty, project satisfaction, these are abstract kind of variables which are very subjective to people and individual. We don't have any mechanism or a very clearly defined scale for that. So the unit of measuring height is there. We know it's either feet or meters. We know that unit for salary is rupees or pesas or dollars or reals, or the temperature is centigrade or Fahrenheit. But there is no unit to measure satisfaction. There is no unit to measure loyalty. There is no exact unit to measure the motivation. So some of the variables are difficult to measure, and that is the challenge the social science researchers have to face. So in this session we're going to focus more on these kind of variables which are difficult to measure, which are very subjective to individuals, for which we cannot have a precise unit of measuring. So we are focusing, this session is on how to measure variables which are abstract, which are not very easily measurable. So and they are very subjective to individuals, their own way of feeling. So let's see that generally the questions we pose to a respondent is the way of collecting data. Sometimes when we want to know the income or the salary of an individual, we could ask that individual a question that how much is your salary? Now this is one way of probing and getting information, getting data. And in this case, the data or the information we require is the salary. So through questions, we are able to probe and get information and data on the variables of our interest. In the case of simple case of let's say the hours worked in the organization is one variable, if that's what is needed. The question could be how long you have been working in the organization, or how many hours have you been working on a daily basis in the organization. So both of these questions basically try to address the variable of interest, which is the hours worked or how long you have been working in the organization. That could be 3 years, 5 years, 2 years, 1 month, 6 months, whatever. And how many hours have you been working on a daily basis? Could be 8 hours, 10 hours, 12 hours, whatever it is. So you have for these variables precise measuring units. And how do we get it? Through the questions. So through questions we probe and get information and against the variables of interest. Another question could be what was the cost of the last project? Now again, the area of interest is, or the variable of interest is cost. So through questions we are able to get some results, some values actually, and we as I said, for these kind of variables it's much easier to obtain specific information for which we can do processing, we can do some mathematical calculation, we can run some statistical tests on them very easily. But some, as we said earlier, need some are abstract or subjective concepts which don't have a precise unit of measuring, such as happiness is one example. Another example, achievement motivation is another example. So effectiveness is another one. So all these, if you look at them, they're a bit difficult to measure because there is no absolute measure of happiness or an absolute measure of motivation or absolute measure of satisfaction. So this is a challenge we are facing. So one cannot simply ask what is the achievement motivation level of employees. This is very arbitrary, very subjective, very difficult to say. We can't just simply come across the management and say, can you tell me that what is the motivation level of your employees? He could say very good, but he cannot say 2.5 meters, or he cannot say 6 million units. You cannot say while measuring the motivation. You don't have a precise unit, but you might, as a manager, might say, well, it's good or very good or excellent, whatever. But again, when a manager uses these terms, uses the term very good or excellent, these are very subjective to the individual himself, because in the mind of the individual, he has some way of maybe establishing a general perception about the motivation level, but that is very specific to the individual. The specific perception of the manager might be wrong, because again it might be right, but it is very specific to the manager, and getting information as to what is the motivation level of your employees from a manager is a very difficult way of measuring, because it's the manager's own perception comes in, which might be right or wrong. He might have his own mechanism of knowing that the employees are satisfied or employees are motivated enough or not. His way of mechanism of measuring is not absolute, it's not standard. So he might see that the reason he feels the employees are motivated because they come on time, or he feels that the employees are motivated because they tend to finish the tasks on time. But that's his way of seeing it. Another manager, when asked about the motivation of his employees, is he might consider different factors which you would believe that are the indicators of motivation, such as if he considered that the normal tasks are fine, and if the employees are doing the normal tasks on time, that is fine, but it is the other non-job specific tasks which if an employee is asked to do and the employee does it, then that indicates that employees are motivated or not. So again, for one manager it could be something else, and for another it could be a completely different thing. So the problem is that we cannot base on subjectiveness of individuals, that how they assess that variable, such as motivation. So that subjectivity is where we need to bring in some kind of mechanism, some kind of system in between, so that we are able to measure these arbitrary concepts or very subjective concepts. So this is where we're talking to the big challenge, is that how we can do that. So but before, as I said, that the abstractness needs to be addressed, and what the general process is that these notions basically needs to be simplified into observable characters. So this is the challenge now. What we need to do is the abstractness of the notion, the feelings, need to be simplified. So we need to say, when we say it's motivation, what do we mean by motivation? Since it is a very abstract notion, abstract feeling, we want to simplify it in a way that we can observe it. So it's a feeling, of course, but we need to simplify it into observable characteristics. We need to see that if you say there is motivation, what is the observable characteristic of it? Is it coming on time? Is it completing the task on time? Or is it getting involved into non-job specific activities which the management might ask them to do? So this is the challenge. This is the challenge. We need to see that how we can remove the abstractness of the notion or the feeling and simplify it into observable characteristics. Another example one could look at is for instance, the thirst. thirst, the thirst cannot be seen, but we expect that a thirsty person would consume a lot of liquid. Now, since thirst is something which is very abstract, we cannot see it, but the observable behavior characteristic is that individual will consume liquid. This is the conversion of the concept thirst, the consumption of liquid. So what we have done is, we're trying to convert an abstract concept as thirst into something which is more measurable, something which is we can see and observe and measure, such as the number of glasses individual consumed, or the amount of liquid the individual consumed could be a representation of thirst. Hence, the behavior of thirsty person is, as I said, drinking fluids, and several individuals say they are thirsty. We can measure the thirst by measuring their consumption of the liquid, although the concept itself, as we started off, which is thirst, was very much abstract. So while reducing the abstract concept, which are into a measurable, is what we call as operationalization. So once we are able to reduce the arbitrary or the subjective concept into a measurable, is what we call as operationalization. So we operationalize or simplify the concept into something which we can measure. So operationally, we say operationally defining a concept so that it becomes measurable is what we are supposed to do, and basically we're trying to see that what are the behavioral dimensions, facets, or properties which represent the concept. So how do we do that? We basically try to see what are the characteristics or dimensions, behavioral dimensions of that particular concept. So whatever the concept might be, with motivation or loyalty or satisfaction, in any of these cases we need to see what are the behavioral dimensions to that, because that's what we can observe. We cannot look into the hearts of people, or we cannot read the minds of the people. All we can do is see the actions, and that actions, that behavior we need to see, and see if there is a loyal person, there is an individual who is very loyal. If he says very loyal, what are his behavioral traits? What are his behavioral dimensions? What are his behavioral properties? So basically, we take up a concept and try to see what are its behavioral characteristics. So every concept we break it down to find, we try to go into deeper and find out what are the behavioral characteristics, and try to see what are the different dimensions of this behavior, which we call as satisfaction, or we call as loyalty, or we call as attitude, whatsoever. So we are saying, so operationally define the concept so that it becomes measurable. The objective is to measure it, and this particular activity is called operationalization. Recapping on the steps of operationalization, we say one needs to basically define the concept. What is the concept? What is thirst? What is thirst? What is satisfaction? We need to define that. Under each concept, we need to possibly quantify the measurable elements needed, which are identified. We need to see what we need to convert it into some kind of behavioral, measurable behaviors, to identify what are the behaviors underneath it, which could be measured. So we need to see whatever these concepts are, and under these concepts, what are the behaviors which are linked to that concept, and see if how can we measure those behaviors. So against each developed concept, specific questions need to be. So once we say that these are the different behaviors we have, so we need to then because we need to collect data on those behaviors. So how we do it? Basically then develop questions addressing those behaviors, such as how often do you stay late for work? In order to complete work, how often you stay late? Now that's the kind of question which will try to address that how committed you are to the organization. Or a question when we're asking as to how much motivated you are, that we can ask them how often have you taken tasks which are not defined as your standard job or tasks assigned to the job. Is it how many times have you taken up tasks which are not part of your job? Could be one way of addressing that, if the individual is motivated enough or not. So meaning that what we're trying to do is we're trying to first of all define the concept, trying to then the next thing we're trying to do is see what are the behavioral traits associated with that concept. Once we define those traits, that sitting late or for motivation, doing extra work, completing the work on time, coming on time, these are different behavioral traits. Now we need to convert these traits into something which is more in terms of in terms of questions, basically, so that we can find out that if individual, how many times or does the individual always come on time. That's a question where we can find out if the individual is regular to his work, is the individual does he completes his task on time. So we can ask him, do you complete your task, or do you always complete your task on time, or how often do you complete your task on time? These are the questions which are trying to tap to measure the behavior which are linked to the concept. So the concept moving converted into behavioral traits, and then behavioral traits are then basically converted into questions against which we will getting the data. So traits, we're moving from the concept to behaviors. From behaviors we basically develop questions. So we are trying to see, we're converting behavior, trying to see what are the behaviors, and behaviors are converted into questions against which we are going to get the data. Okay, so now the operational definition, as we say, is a statement of specific dimensions and elements through which a concept will become measurable. So any concept such as staff satisfaction, employee satisfaction, customer satisfaction, loyalty, success, employee success, organization success, whatever these variables are, which are basically concepts, which are abstract concepts. When we try to convert these concepts into and convert into their behavioral traits, that's when we say the behavioral, the operational definition of that concept is where basically try to define the dimensions and the elements through which we can measure them. So any concept like loyalty, its operational definition will consist of the different dimensions and elements which will help us measure that. So any concept which is abstract and which needs to measure, we need to then basically need to define it. We need to have its operational definition of it. So these concepts which need to be operationalized, we basically try to see if they are easily measurable or not. Okay, so the operational definition of learning, let's say, for example, we are looking at the example of learning. We're saying the operational definition of learning could be stated as the ability to recall the lessons. It is also the ability to apply the lessons learned to the practical situation, and finally it is the understanding of the lessons. So while operationally defining learning, we're trying to define learning, the operational definition of learning. It consists of the dimensions such as ability to recall, ability to apply the lesson, practically apply the lesson in the practical situation, and able to understand the concept or the basically the issue. So here, while learning is a concept which is arbitrary, we are trying to give an operational definition of it, and the definition could be something like that it is the ability to recall lessons. It is also the ability to apply the lessons learned in the practical situation, and finally it is the understanding of the lesson. Though we have learning, we have defined it in a way which is called the operational definition, in a way whereby it is trying to reflect upon or trying to highlight the different dimensions which are the basically the facets or the characteristics or the behaviors when we are trying to see if learning was done or not. So even though these dimensions have an extent of we have reduced some of the ambiguity, but again we will find that some of them need further elaboration. So let's say that when we say understanding, what do we mean by understanding? So we need to sometimes need to further elaborate and say what do we mean by understanding. Again, understanding might be again something arbitrary, it may be again which is not very clear. So we need to see that what is the main concept, see what are the possible behavioral traits against it, which becomes the dimensions. And within the dimensions, if we find that some of the dimensions need further elaboration, we need to operationalize those sub-dimensions into elements. And let's look at it. That with some sort of effort, if we say that we're saying what is understanding, so we need to with some effort we define what's meant by understanding. That is the ability to answer the questions correctly. So under the understanding concept, because again we see that what is understanding might be itself arbitrary or very subjective, we try to further define it and say understanding is the ability to answer questions correctly and to give appropriate answers. So we started off with a concept called learning. We tried to see what are the behavioral traits of it or the dimensions of it, which were understanding, ability to understand, ability to apply, ability to recall. All these were the different dimensions of learning, but within these dimensions of learning, understanding needed further elaboration, which is that it is the ability to answer the questions correctly and give appropriate answers to the different problems. And the other aspect, as I said, application, was that application needs to be further defined, which is the ability to apply the lessons in a practical situation. So we need to basically see that how can we reduce the ambiguity in the different concepts, and within the concepts, sub-concepts, and sub-concept needs to further need to be reduced in a way that all the ambiguity is removed, and we are then able to properly measure that concept. Let's look at it. That the example we were just giving you, that let's say we said learning is the concept which has been broken down into understanding, retention, and application. And when we say that understanding, if we want to see and we want to measure if learning has really existed or individual was able to learn, we need to ask that individual questions on that was he able to understand what he has learned, was he able to recall what he is able to understand, was he able to apply that. So the first level, one could say, of the operational definition of the learning is that these are the three traits or dimensions or characteristics of learning. That is, there will be some understanding achieved, some retention made, and some application to be done of the area or the thing which you have learned. And once we look at understanding, we say a learning basically can be measured if you are able to answer proper questions correctly or give appropriate examples. This is the indication or the actual real behavior which needs to be addressed. So underneath these, basically what you need to do is ask questions. You need to ask questions addressing that. Were you able to answer the questions correctly? Were you able to give appropriate examples to the situation? If you are able to do that, then you've been able to understand. But then you need to ask were you able to recall the material? If you are able to recall the material, then we'll say, okay, that's another tick for learning, because you've been able to learn and you'll be able to recall the lesson. And the thing under the application, you need to see if you're able to apply the concept understood. If you're able to apply the concept to solve a problem, then again we will say the learning was achieved. And then if you're able to integrate this knowledge which you've learned with some other relevant material, then again we will say that the application side of the learning has occurred. So three dimensions will basically try to explain the behavior of learning. And as I said, learning is, if you look at it, is very subjective, very difficult to measure, and we have tried to give an operational definition of learning, and within that what we did was we defined the dimensions and sub-elements of those dimensions so that we can measure that. Now this understanding, as generally if you give a straightforward question, were you able to learn the lesson? And if this is a question one could pose, simple as that have you been able to learn in this class? This could be very subjective to the individual responding. He might respond from the point of view of recalling that, yes, I've learned because I was able to retain or recall. But then if you ask another individual, he might not just think that learning is to do with retention. He might just focus on understanding, and he might answer the question from this point of view, that is, yes, he is able to answer the questions properly and give appropriate examples. So while asking a straightforward question that have you been able to learn, two different individuals might give completely answers from two different perspectives. One might focus on the retention, while the other might be focusing on understanding. And while you're trying to accumulate and trying to see if how well the individuals were able to learn the lesson, you will get different values, different data for that, because the individual who's answering a very simple question that have you been able to learn might focus on two different things or three different things. So you see, the problem with that is if you just simply ask if you're able to learn or how are you thirsty, these are very subjective. What you need to do is see and break it down into some observable behavioral concepts, dimensions, and then address those dimensions separately, so the full concept is addressed. So the best way in this case, if you want to see if the learning has occurred, is you need to ask the respondent questions on were you able to understand, were you able to retain, were you able to apply. and then sub-questions within that. You need to basically ask basically 6 questions to really measure the learning done by an individual rather than just one. So if you have just one question, you see the problem with that is that you might answer that question from just one aspect or 2 aspects, but not all the 3 aspects. Whereas if you have different questions, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different questions addressed from the same individual, then you are able to get a wholesome, a complete picture of learning from that individual. So the value of learning or the amount of information you're getting here is more complete as compared to something where you're just simply asking a question. So this is very important, that while we are trying to address an abstract concept, very subjective concept, we need to really see what are the underlying dimensions of it and then ask questions on those rather than a simple straightforward question that are you satisfied. That's a very superficial level of a question, or have you been able to learn, or what is your, or are you loyal to the organization. Now this is you need to see, you don't know what is, from which point of view the individual has answered that question. So you need to guide the individual, the respondent, to focus on all the different aspects and give answers for those separate aspects separately. So this is again what we looked at as an operational definition of learning. Another example we have here is of stress. If you look at stress basically has been broken down into physical tension, emotional or psychological tension, or mental tensions. So what they have done is the researchers have, what they have done is stress is the main concept broken down into sub-dimensions, and within the dimension such as physical tension, they did not subclassify, because physical tension they said they could be measured through blood pressure and pulse. So this is something which is more quantitative in nature, which can be easily measured. But emotional, psychological tension needs to be measured on 3 different aspects, such as the nervousness of the individual, the anxiety of the individual, the fear factor in the individual. Now these are the sub-dimensions of the dimension emotional or psychological tension. And mental tension can be again measured by headaches, fatigue, confusion, making unusual number of mistakes, as these are more measurable, these are more quantitative in nature, but this is more on qualitative in nature. So this has been, since this is more qualitative in nature, it has been again further broken down into 3 sub-dimensions. So to the extent that you are able to measure them to a level. So while measuring, you could just say, you can ask a question, do you feel stress at your job? Could be a very straightforward question. But a real true measure of stress would be that you will need to find information on the physical tension level, that is, what is the blood pressure, pulse rate. You need to find information on the emotional psychological tension, that is the nervousness level, the anxiety level, the fear level of that individual, and the mental tension would be then need to be measured as well, to really measure the stress of an individual. So it is, as we can see, it's quite a handful, it's quite challenging, as opposed to a simple, straightforward variable. A variable such as stress, loyalty, satisfaction needs its operational definitions, and we need to address separate questions for that. For these sub-dimension stress, we have some examples of the questions which could be asked, such as, to what extent do you feel anxious and nervousness? Now this is trying to address the issue of anxiousness of the individual. Separately, how often you feel unduly pressured by the events that happen in the life. how often you are confused of the situation, how frequently you had headaches or stomach upsets, how often you feel the demands on you are overwhelming, how often your blood pressure has shot up in the last 6 months, how well do you sleep at night, how do you feel that you are going to have a nervous breakdown, are you troubled by hand sweating so that you feel damp and clammy, do you wake up rested in the morning. Now this is trying to measure stress, and from all different aspects, such as we looked at from the mental tension point of view, from the emotional point of view, from the physical point of view. So the questions have been addressed on all the aspects here. If you see, it's trying to address all the aspects now, trying to get a more wholesome, a more complete picture of stress, to establish that individual is stressed or not stressed, by simply asking if you are stressed or not stressed is a very superficial way of asking. The true measure of stress would be ideally measured through these operational dimensions and elements and subdimensions, and these questions we need to address. So now from trying to get an accumulated picture from that. So if one needs to see if the individual is stressed, we need to accumulate all the results from here and try to see what is the overall stress level gained from this these 10 different questions. So out of the 10 different questions, we are then able to establish a more complete picture of the individual if he's stressed out and not. Another example, let's have a look at it, is of enriched job, and we do have some questions also linked to these things. Just briefly looking at it, we said that enriched job would be where you will have some kind of, we will have the job offers challenge. It provides autonomy, uses all your skills, offers a whole job, not fragmented of work, offers a sense of meaningness, offers feedback. See, so there are so many dimensions when we say if job is enriched. Is your job enriched? This is again a very superficial question, but we want to ask the real and establish the real meaning of in an individual. If that the job is enriched, we need to ask him, the individual, if the job offers challenge, is the job offers autonomy. So we're saying job enrichment is basically will be when the individual have challenging job, will be given autonomy to do whatever he feels is correct or right. He is able to use all the possible skills he has, offers a complete job, not a portion of a job, so he can complete a task from start to end, offers a sense of meaningfulness. There is some meaning to what he's doing, and then it offers him a feedback. So when we're saying that the job is enriched, or is your job enriched, we need to ask the individual questions such as these, like, to what extent you find your job challenging? To what extent do your job use all the skills and knowledge you possess? To what extent does your job permit you to do a task from beginning to end? How repetitious is your duties? How much opportunity do you have to do your job from beginning to end? So keeping these things in mind, we can see that all of them are trying to, these are actual questions which are linked to these dimensions which we had identified. So these 12 questions versus one simple question, the job enriched, will not do the justice one needs to do with these kind of a variable. So we need to if you truly need to measure that, we need to find the operational definition of those variables, and under each operational definition we need to develop some specific questions addressing those operational definitions, operational dimensions of that concept. Once we are able to do that, That's only then we are able to with comfort say yes, we have been able to measure this concept to an extent. Of course, we cannot be absolutely correct on or absolutely sure, but we are trying to get as close as possible to the actual value, or the actual value of stress, actual value of loyalty, actual value of satisfaction. Of course, a complete measure is very difficult because it's as I said, it's something to do with the way we feel, the way we think, the way we are basically exposed to different situations, the experiences we might have. So it is dependent on so many things. So we are trying to somehow convert the abstractness, ambiguityness of within a term and make it in a way that it is more measurable, and this is what operationalization is supposed to do. Although we have talked about so much about the what is operational definition, what is operationalization, we need to also make sure that we differentiate operationalization from what is not operationalization. Operational does not define the correlation of the concepts. That is, what I mean by that is that the motivation and, let's say, performance are two separate concepts. They might be correlated, but we cannot substitute one for the other, meaning that when we're saying motivation and performance, basically these are two separate concepts. We cannot say that, although they might be very much correlated, meaning that an individual who's very much motivated might show high performance, making them being able to correlate these two variables doesn't indicate that performance is a measure of motivation. No, performance is a separate concept, whereas motivation is a separate concept. We need to make sure that we differentiate between what we call as the antecedents and the dimensions of a concept. What we mean by that is we need to make sure and differentiate between the factors or the variables which influences a variable, meaning that, let's say, performance is affected by motivation, correct? But motivation is measured in a different way. Similarly, when we said that learning is measured through retention, through understanding, through application. These are dimensions, but learning could be affected by, let's say, the environment or the level of the instructor's expertise or the level of the student's skill himself or the IQ level of the individual. Now, the IQ level is something which might affect learning, or the teacher's expertise might influence learning, but nevertheless it's not measuring learning. For measuring learning, we need to use the terms, we need to go into the dimensions such as understanding, retention and application, whereas we say what can affect learning: the level of instructor's expertise, the availability of the books, the number of hours spent, and so forth. So we need to differentiate between the antecedents or the factors which influences our concept, and we need to separate them from the dimensions. Dimensions are basically the ones which actually measure the concept, and antecedents are the variables which actually affect the variable, or they basically influence the variable. So we need to differentiate between the reasons, that is the factors, the antecedents, with dimensions. We need to make sure that we are different. So in learning, the expertise of individual, the instructor, the hours spent in learning are considered to be as factors, whereas while measuring learning itself, it's the understanding, it is the application, it is the retention as to the dimensions which are basically measuring the concept. And again, we said earlier that once we start measuring, we would start defining dimensions and elements. We need to ask questions which are able to measure that concept, and we basically are, in certain cases, we are able to measure certain variables straightforward in a simple way, but sometimes we are not able to do that. And as we said that the way to go about measuring an abstract concept is while defining its dimensions. And one way, of course, is to go to the subject experts, who are the best people to define the dimensions, because we as researchers might not have the required amount of exposure or the knowledge to define a certain concept, such as, again, stress, or the concept such as satisfaction. That's the job of the experts, to really define what is the dimensions or the behavioral aspects or characteristics of that particular concept. So while defining the dimensions, we tend to go to the experts to do the job. So that's their job of doing it. But our job is to make sure that we try to find out the appropriate operational definition of these different concepts. And there are a number of concepts which have been already operationalized. We don't need to really operationalize these concepts at this stage, because most of these concepts have been operationalized. What we need to make sure is apply those concepts. The reason we gave this talk, this lengthy talk, was that we need to use these rather than develop these as researchers, because our main objective might be to solve an organization problem or industry problem. We basically don't need to develop the tools. The tools are been already developed, so we need to use those tools. So the idea here is that the tools are there. We need to use the right, correct tools to measure the specific concept. So let's recap what we did earlier. We said that measurement is necessary to give answers to the research questions, and unless we don't measure, we won't be able to collect some data, and if we don't have data, we won't be able to give any answers that how many people are having salaries more than 50,000, how many have less than 50,000, how many people are more than 50 and how many are less than 50. We don't know, we can't say that how many employees are motivated and how many employees are not motivated. These answers will be only answered, or these questions will be only answered when we ask the questions. And when we ask questions, then these questions need to be measured against some kind of variables, and variables need to be sometimes variables which are direct. Their unit of measurement is very clear and easy to use, but some variables are abstract, and for them measuring the concept needs operationalization. Once the concept has been operationalized, the revised definition of that concept with the dimensions and elements mentioned in the definition is called the operational definition of the concept. And basically in the operational definition concept, we try to break it down, the concept into dimensions and its elements. These dimensions and elements have been basically synthesized or drawn from the different behavioral characteristics of that concept. So we try to see and link the different behaviors with these abstract concepts, and we try to see what are different behaviors. All these behaviors are then termed into dimensions, and again, if some dimensions need further elaboration, further operationalization, we again do a further operationalization of those dimensions into subdimensions, and then each subdimension or dimension is linked with the element. Element is where you're trying to actually measure the dimension itself. it's the actual behavior which needs to, or the actual incident of the behavior which needs to be measured. So against each element we basically formulate questions, and with each questions then we try to collect some kind of a data. Once we collect the data, then we are only able to do the different kind of analysis on that questions, and then we are able to do the different, and then we are able to come to some conclusion and results of the study. And lastly, what we talked about was that we want to make sure we don't confuse the dimension with the factors, or dimension with the antecedents. When we say factors or antecedents, these are the reasons of which are influencing the variable, the concept variable. So if the concept variable is being influenced by some external factors or different antecedents, then we need to make sure that we don't include them into the actual variable itself. As we gave the example of learning, that learning is affected by the expertise level of the instructor. Learning is affected by the availability of the resources and so forth. But these are the factors which influences learning. But if I'm measuring learning itself, then I need to measure it separately using the questions on: have you been able to understand, have you been able to apply, have you been able to retain. So the difference between them is, on one the factors are influencing learning, but learning is measured by the concepts, by the dimensions such as retention, such as application, such as the application, the retention, and the understanding. So we need to separate them from each other and not confuse with that. Finally, I would say that wherever possible, when we are dealing with these kind of variables, we try to look for the operational definition of these variables, and try to see and try to use the questions which have been developed for these operational dimensions of these variables. And instead of being very superficial on and asking straightforward questions, we would rather try to get the correct information. So as researchers, I would recommend that we might at certain level compromise on the breadth of the study, because we might not be able to consider so many variables which might be part of our study, because each variable, of especially variables such as the ones we are talking now, where the concepts are abstract, each variable might be basically based on 5 or 10 or 15 or 20 questions if you truly want to measure that. So if you're including so many variables in your study, the problem with that is your instrument or your questionnaire might become very long, and again collecting data may become very difficult. So sometimes it's good, or sometimes it's recommended that you focus on fewer variables, but you measure them properly, so there is no ambiguity left, there is no subjectiveness left to the respondent. But what we try to do is get the as close as to and make sure that every respondent responds at the same level, with the same understanding, with the same concepts. So we are able to measure that variable properly. So rather than having so many variables, it is recommended that you focus on few of the variables, but trying to get as much information and as appropriate and the full information for that abstract concept variable. And then of course for variables which are less abstract, of course you can have them, but for them, of course, there is not much of a challenge. But what you need to do is the operational variables need to be selected properly. So with this, we conclude our session for today, and the next thing we're going to talk about in the next session is how to use different scales to measure these different variables, because for each variable which has been broken down into dimensions and elements, and against each element we were able to formulate a question. Now, while collecting data against these questions, we need to use some kind of a scale through which we can measure the response of the user. So in the next session we're going to talk about that. With this we say Assalamu alaikum and meet you in the next session. Allah Hafiz.